Hi guys, welcome to the second lesson of Unit 3. Remember that Unit 3 is all about argumentation, and especially right now we're working on noticing other people's arguments. So in Lesson 1, we talked about determining perspectives and then being able to express those perspectives as an argument. That's tricky. Today we're going to be talking about how once we are able to express an argument, then not only strengthening our own arguments that we're expressing, but noticing how other people strengthen their arguments as well. So it's not just about making that statement and knowing what our perspectives are and being able to express our argument, but then being able to add strength behind the argument as we continue to talk about it. And one of the main ways that this happens is by using the what we call three rhetorical appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, this is basically an introduction to ethos, pathos, and logos. Some of you may have heard of these before. This lesson will go into some detail about how they're used, but certainly is not going to cover everything that you could possibly ever know about this. But it's good. It's a good starting point from which you can then build up to other more advanced understandings of this that will come down the road, especially in an AP language class where you'll spend the whole year talking about ethos, pathos, and logos. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about each one, shall we? So when we talk about ethos, pathos, and logos, we're talking about what appeals to our audience, right? So if we have an argument that we're trying to make, for example, if the argument that we're trying to make is to our parents, and we're trying to get our parents to agree to extend our curfew by an hour, then we might phrase our argument like this: even though other teenagers aren't always responsible, I'm more responsible than most, therefore you should extend my curfew by an hour. And if we look at that argument, we can see we've got a perspective of fact. So even though other teenagers aren't always responsible, well, we can look at the experiences of our friends and things that we've heard, and we can say that's pretty much a fact. Teenagers aren't always responsible. We've got a perspective of value. I'm more responsible than most. So we're valuing ourselves above those other less responsible teenagers, right? So contrasting fact and value. Therefore, and then our policy is you should, or my parents should, extend my curfew by an hour. Now that is the argument expressed. We still need to actually convince our parents that what we're saying is true. So as we continue to talk through this argument with our parents, we're going to be appealing to ethos and pathos and logos. So let's start with ethos. Ethos is, when we're appealing to our parents, we're trying to convince our parents or our audience by building up our reputation, or by establishing our authority, or by showing our expertise. So ethos is all about reputation, authority, and expertise. It's the things that just are about you that make your audience believe that you're worth listening to on this topic. All right. So as you're expanding on your argument, some of the ways that you will argue is just building up that reputation, building up that authority, building up that expertise so that your argument is stronger. One way that you might phrase a sentence that's defending your argument by building up ethos could sound like this: my reputation is stellar because I've never broken curfew before, so I've proven I can be trusted, right? So we're providing evidence that's specifically intended to build up our trustworthiness, right? To build up our reputation, and that's where ethos comes in. Now that might be effective for your parents, but it might not be enough. So in addition to building up our ethos and making ourselves worth listening to, then we also might need to add a little bit of pathos or pathos to our argument. And pathos is when we're trying to convince our audience by making that audience feel emotionally. So rather than relying on our reputation and our trustworthiness, we're appealing directly to specific emotions that are going to make our audience sympathetic to our perspective. And so a sentence or a piece of evidence that's going to appeal to pathos is going to sound different than a sentence that's appealing to ethos. It might sound something more like this. All of my friends' curfews are later than mine, and you wouldn't want me to be embarrassed by going home early, would you? And so instead of just saying, look, I'm trustworthy, I have a good reputation, you're now kind of saying, well, like, wouldn't you feel bad for me if you made me feel this certain way? And embarrassment is an emotion, but of course you can appeal to other emotions as well, right? Like you could appeal to anger, you could appeal to love, you could appeal to sadness, you could appeal to any time that you're appealing to an emotion, you have to consider, well, is that emotion going to be the most useful emotion in this case? Now, both of those strategies are well and good, and they might work. However, there's a third option, and the third option is logos, and a lot of people will, notice that that sounds a lot like logic, right? So, um, logos is when instead of appealing to reputation and trustworthiness or bringing up specific emotions, you're trying to be very rational about something. So just, going from if this, then this, therefore that, our argument is phrased in a very logical, rational way. So, but you continue that kind of rational, like uh, train of thought to get your audience to agree with your argument. So if we were to write a sentence that appealed to logos, it might sound something like this: if you want me to grow into a responsible adult, then it makes sense to give me more adult responsibilities. So we've got this very logical line of reasoning, right? If, therefore, or if then, right? It goes from one to another, and you're just kind of laying out the way that you want your audience to think about these things. So you have these three options, and you have to consider, well, what is best for your audience? If you're making this argument to your dad and he's a very logical person, then you probably want to lean heavily on the logos side. If you're making this argument to your mom and she is all about emotion, she's a very emotional person, then maybe you want to lean a little bit heavier on the pathos. And then, of course, ethos for some people. Some people really respond to authority. So you want to think about who are you arguing with and what's going to be more convincing to them. Of course, that's an oversimplification of the situation because nobody is purely ethical, nobody is purely pathological, nobody is purely logical. We all have, aspects of ourselves that respond to those different appeals. So usually the best way to make an argument is to use multiple appeals at the same time, and that's going to strengthen that argument even more. And the more you're able to balance ethos, pathos, and logos, the stronger your argument, the more convincing your argument is going to be. So if we look at ethos, logos, and pathos not as separate things, but as things that overlap, and as things that can build upon each other, then we can start to see where using just ethos is going to be the weakest way to make an argument, or using just logos or pathos for others, like other examples. But if we find a way to combine ethos and pathos to appeal both to our authority and to the emotions of the other person, then that person is going to be probably a little bit more willing to you know go along with your argument. But of course, the strongest way to make an argument is to make an argument that that appeals to all three at the same time. So the person is, convinced of your authority, feels emotionally similar to you, and also sees the logic behind going along with your side. And that's the sweet spot that you really want to try to hit when making an argument. You may also notice that other people are doing this. When you start looking at other people's arguments, you might say, oh, this is how they're appealing to ethos, or this is how they're appealing to pathos or logos. And the better you get, the more you're going to see how they're combining those different strategies. People do this without even thinking about it. But if you think about it and you plan it, you can do it even better than when you don't think about it. So what you're going to be doing now is you're going to be looking at a piece of writing and noticing how an author uses those appeals in their argument. I want you to come back to class ready and willing to share what you find in that piece of writing.